Osio Nagad, Jennifer Loren Wado. Hello everyone, I'm Jennifer Loren, Cherokee Nation citizen and host of Osio, Voices of the Cherokee People. Welcome to Chalagi, wherever we are. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 sealed the fate of tribes across the country. At the hands of the federal government, the removal, more commonly known as the Trail of Tears, was the darkest time in Cherokee history. Today's guests will help us to deepen our understanding of the removal by sharing what we know about the mindset of our Cherokee leaders of that time, the statesmen who made decisions that would affect generations to come, and common Cherokees who endured events of the removal. We'll begin today's show with messages from Deputy Chief Bryan Warner and Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. Then stay tuned for a short video featuring a first-hand account of the forced removal of our people. We will then be joined by former at-large tribal council member Jack Baker, along with Krystan Moser. With them, we will examine what life was like for our people leading up to the removal, and later discuss the trail itself and what our ancestors found when they arrived in Indian Territory. We also want to share with you a short video about Cherokee Nation citizen Joseph Erb, as he guided a group of Remember the Removal bike riders. We will hear from our at-large counselors, Julia Coates and Johnny Jack Kidwell, and finally, Kevin Stretch will end our show with some parting thoughts from community and cultural outreach. But before we begin, we want to let you know that everyone participating here in the studio today, including the crew, has been vaccinated and today tested negative for COVID. And due to the recent surge in the Omicron strain, we are masked while we are in the studio, including on camera, and following social distancing guidelines. Hopefully you can see I'm smiling with my eyes. Deputy Chief of the Cherokee Nation, Bryan Warner, now joins us to lead us in prayer and then talk about the importance of today's topic, which is the removal, commonly referred to as the Trail of Tears. Thank you again for joining us, Deputy Chief Warner.
Wado, Jennifer. Well, let's stand and go to our Lord in prayer, if we will. Please bow your heads. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this day, Lord, and we thank you for this time of fellowship. Lord, thank you for being there with us and guiding and measuring each of our steps as we make plans throughout our life. Lord, help us to remember the times that we had when things just weren't quite going right, but you were always there with us. Thank you, Lord, for filling our vessel with the fruit of your Spirit, Lord. Thank you for the joy that you give us each and every day, Lord. Thank you for the mercy and the grace that you give so freely. And help us to remember, Lord, that it is this grace and this mercy that we need to give others freely as we love our brothers and sisters, as we love ourselves. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so today's topic is very important, I know, to both Principal Chief Hoskin and yourself.
Oh, it is, Jennifer, and it's something that's important that we remember and that we don't forget, because I think there's little nuggets of time that will help us to get through future events. So I appreciate you having us here today. Well, CO, thank you once again for tuning in and streaming this informative program. In the middle of winter in 1838, the Cherokee people were forcibly marched across 7 states without even the proper clothing for harsh weather. They were alienated from their beloved ancestral homelands and faced enormous challenges of adapting to a new land with limited knowledge of the terrain, plants, or even animals. Cherokees were forced from their home on the orders of a president who had defied a U.S. Supreme Court decision that we have the right to self-govern. As the U.S. military rounded up Cherokees to remove to Indian Territory, our ancestral lands were immediately open to settlement by outsiders. 1/4 of the population perished during the journey, mostly due to disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The highest mortality rates were among the very old and the very young, and no family was immune from tragedy. The loss of life was catastrophic for the Cherokee people. The forced march began in Red Clay, Tennessee, the location of the last eastern capital of the Cherokee Nation. It ended in Indian Territory, now modern-day Oklahoma. Like the phoenix, we rose from the ashes in our darkest chapter. And today, we are thriving on our reservation in northeastern Oklahoma. Our sovereign government, fueled with the vibrant culture and a vital language, helped us through the adversity of that journey and makes us stronger today. As a way to always remember our history, we annually support a group of young Cherokees who retrace the trail on bikes. We follow this annual event closely through social media, and later you'll learn more about the Remember the Removal Youth Leadership Program. Cherokee Nation riders, along with our relatives from the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, trek from Georgia to Tahlequah annually to honor our ancestors who walked the trail. The experience is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to live part of our history firsthand. The riders learn of some of the trials and tribulations our ancestors experienced many years ago, but more importantly, they summon the fortitude of our ancestors to complete the ride. We do this every year so that every generation can join us in remembering our ancestors. The Trail of Tears is a profound part of our history, and it is critically important that we maintain the connections, those who walk before us and those who will walk after us. We continue to make investments to preserve our historical sites along the removal route, as well as sites throughout our reservation. That includes our iconic Capitol building on the square in Tahlequah, which is now the world-class history museum. Cherokee people suffered through harsh conditions, experienced loss of all their worldly possessions, and endured heartbreak, physical pain, and the loss of loved ones on the trail. Yet, we endured and now are stronger than ever. So we honor and remember our ancestors' sacrifices, reminding us of where we have been and where we are going. Wado.
Wado. As you might imagine, Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. is very passionate about sharing Cherokee perspectives regarding removal. He's here now to share his perspectives on the removal and the resilience of Cherokees, both then and now. Chief Hoskin?
Wado, Jennifer. OSIO, from our success as society builders to the deep wounds of forced removal, the history of the Cherokee Nation is intertwined with the history and development of the United States. Cherokee culture thrived for generations prior to European contact in the southeastern United States. Cherokees have created sophisticated societies numerous times in our ancient and modern history. Our original and ancestral homelands are in the southeastern United States. The lands across modern-day states like Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina are where our tribal systems of government and education were born. These are the places where our ancestors are buried and where our ceremonies originated and were shared. By the 1820s, significant pressures were brought to bear on our people, our resources, and our government. Settlers in states like Georgia wanted to displace the Cherokee people from our homelands, take our resources, and in the process, undermine our government. Our resistance to these efforts built something strong in our national character. But ultimately, President Andrew Jackson's removal policies forced us out. Thousands of Cherokee people, men, women, and children, were rounded up and herded, many at bayonet point, on a forced march of 1,000 miles, ending with our arrival in our new homeland. Thousands died on the journey that became known as the Trail of Tears. It will forever remain one of the darkest and cruelest chapters of American history. Upon settling in our new home, our Cherokee ancestors established a new government in the town of Tahlequah. Though the pressure of removal temporarily divided us, we reunited as one Cherokee Nation. We adopted a new constitution, invested in our great democracy, and based our government on the rule of law. We invested in education, paved the way for commerce, and we took care of each other. We created a great society just years after the United States attempted to destroy us. That single unified Cherokee Nation was built strong and remains strong today. It was built by our ancestors who endured much suffering, who lost more than 4,000 of their fellow countrymen along the Trail of Tears. It was built by a people who never gave up. That same spirit remains alive and well in the Cherokee people today. We are a government that provides our citizens with essential services like health and human services, education and employment services, housing, economic development opportunities, and environmental protection. However, we will always continue to tell the Cherokee story of perseverance in the face of forced removal and suffering. We tell our wonderful story in many ways, from our museums to our internet resources to the Emmy-winning TV series OSIO, Voices of the Cherokee People. We are telling our story like never before. We're particularly proud of this series, Jalagi Wherever We Are, which connects with citizens near and far during a time when connecting virtually is very important. Telling our history ensures it is preserved and told accurately. It is a way to pass our story down for future generations of Cherokees. Our nation's journey, physical and spiritual, encompasses the epic efforts of our Cherokee leaders, like Chief John Ross, to ensure that our people survived. Today, we're using our success to build stronger and healthier families, provide a quality education to our children, make healthcare accessible, ensure our citizens have safe housing and good jobs, preserving family, community, and culture. These remain our core Cherokee cultural values. I hope you enjoy today's edition of Jalagi Wherever We Are, as we explore this critical chapter of Cherokee history before and after removal. This history, this chapter in our existence, and how we persevered, is such an important part of who we are as Cherokees. It is also an important part of our future. We survived and thrived after our forced removal because our ancestors had a sense of shared destiny and a recognition that if we were to survive in a changing world, we needed to build up our collective strength. Although we face different challenges today, that lesson from history is as timeless and important as ever. Wado.
Wado Chief, thank you for joining me over here on the couch. We have a few questions that we would like to ask you. Okay, so first, can you tell us when you first learned about the removal and the impact that it had on you at that time?
You know, my earliest memory was actually with my father in the Veneta post office, long before he was a state representative or a teacher or all the other things he's done in his career. He was a letter carrier at the post office. He would take me in the post office. There was a mural depicting removal, depicting the Treaty of New Echota. And he would explain to me, as a 5 or 6 year old might understand, what was going on, what happened to our people. And of course, at that time, I couldn't fully grasp what happened, but to share that moment with my father and to sort of have a visual reference to what happened during the Trail of Tears through that mural, as I'd learned more about it through high school and then on to college, I always thought back to that. And that depiction in that mural with soldiers with bayonets pointing it at Cherokee people was very powerful to me, and it still is.
Yeah. I'm curious to know how your understanding of this topic has changed over time. As your leadership roles within the Cherokee Nation have grown, first from being a tribal counselor to the Secretary of State, now Principal Chief, in what ways has your understanding of this topic shifted, perhaps?
Well, my understanding has certainly gotten deeper over the years, and I certainly hope as time goes by it gets even more deeper as I explore, and I think as we collectively explore that history. From that simple moment with my father, seeing the mural, seeing the soldiers rounding our people up, what I've grown to understand more over time is that, yes, we were removed, and yes, it's a dark chapter in the history of the United States, but our resistance to removal, what we did to stand our ground, is really important. I think it built something up in our national character that even though we were removed, it built some strength in us. And we needed that strength. We needed it for what was to happen next after removal. We needed it to survive when we rebuilt our great democracy, our great society. I think over time, I've come to appreciate that our ancestors didn't just survive the physical trauma of removal, and it was traumatic, lost a quarter of our population, our political system ripped apart. But the fact that we rebuilt, I think, is something very special that I hope the Cherokee people take some time to reflect on. Where we are now at this part of American history is we're facing a lot of challenges, not the same challenges that our ancestors faced, but we still need to tap into that same idea that we're in it together, that same idea of unity. And that's how we really survived removal and rebuilt, is we had this sense of a shared destiny that we had a place to go together. We still need to have that. And as chief, I try to think about that every day, that yes, Cherokee people have their differences, but there's so much that we have in common. We have to have that shared focus where we can.
Absolutely. I know a lot of Cherokee citizens certainly still feel that sense of community and that sense of working together through this.
Yes.
Our final question is, for our viewers out there, what message do you want them to consider most when they're considering the removal, maybe both before the removal and after the removal?
I want the Cherokee people to feel the same pride that I feel when I think about what our ancestors did before removal. So let's just focus for a moment on that time period when there was so much change happening around us, and we're still in a changing world today. We were able to strengthen ourselves internally as people. We adapted our institutions where we needed to. Sequoia developed the written language, which helped strengthen the Cherokee people and the Cherokee Nation. I think there's a great deal of pride we can take from that. I think post-removal, the same sense of pride we can also take. And that is this idea that, yes, the United States almost destroyed one of the great democracies in the world, the Cherokee Nation. Yes, they ripped apart our institutions and led us on a path that cost us so much life, so much treasure. And yet our ancestors persevered and created this great society. I just want the Cherokee people to think about that and to apply those lessons to what we're doing today, because there's a great deal of effort we need to put forth on a lot of challenges. One of the challenges today is protecting ourselves against the pandemic. That's why you and I are wearing masks today. But there's other challenges, saving our language, making sure that we create opportunities in our reservation for young people to get jobs, for elders to be secure in their twilight years, and for communities to gain all sorts of strength, from economic strength to strength in education, protecting the environment. All of those things require us, again, to look back into history. What got us here? What saved us? We can apply those lessons to what we're doing today. And that's what I hope the Cherokee people do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your time with us, Wado Chief.
Wado.
Next, we have for you an excerpt from an OsiyoTV Cherokee Almanac. Reverend Daniel Buttrick was a missionary who traveled with one of the many Cherokee detachments on the Trail of Tears and wrote daily journal entries. His entries include pleas to the federal government, as well as outcries about the suffering and unimaginable conditions endured by our ancestors during the removal. This remains one of the few first-hand accounts of the removal that we have today.
The Brainerd Mission Cemetery, a sacred acre burrowed in present-day Chattanooga, Tennessee, encroached by its busy streets and a bustling shopping center. In the 1800s, the cemetery laid along the rolling hills of the old Cherokee Nation, nestled alongside the Brainerd Mission Station, where Reverend Daniel Buttrick worked as a missionary to the Cherokees. Reverend Buttrick's journal is one of the only detailed first-hand accounts of the Trail of Tears and tells the tragic stories of several Cherokees buried in this hallowed ground. His journal begins in 1838, as Cherokees who had not already left for the West were rounded up into concentration camps, one of them near this site. June 17, 1838. On this day we were called to follow the remains of a poor Cherokee woman to the grave. I knelt down and prayed for her dear departing soul. I was at once overcome and wept aloud in contemplating the condition of these dear sick people. June 18, 1838. Today we are called to perform the funeral obsequies of a little child who died with the body flux. His afflicted mother was permitted to fetch him from the camps this morning. The child seemed already in the agonies of death when she arrived. On the 19th, the young man above mentioned was carried to the grave, and on the 20th, a middle-aged woman followed. June 28, 1838. It is said that many old women driven in this company cried like children when they started, saying they never could live to walk that journey in this hot season, but their cries could not be heard. They were driven on.
Welcome back. Joining me today is Jack Baker, the current president of the National Trail of Tears Association and a former Cherokee Nation at-large tribal counselor of 11 years. Jack probably knows more about this subject than any other living person. Also here today is Krystan Moser, Senior Manager of Collections and Exhibits with Cherokee Nation Cultural Tourism. Krystan is also very knowledgeable about the removal period in our history. Welcome, Mr. Baker and Krystan. We're honored to have you both here today. So what we want to focus on in this segment are the pre-removal actions, things happening in Washington, as well as in the Cherokee homelands. We want to understand the emotions and experiences of our ancestors that lived during this tumultuous time. We're really looking forward to hearing your perspectives on this. And so, Jack, I'll begin with you. There are many books and things for people to read on the actions of the state of Georgia and the federal government and the Cherokee Nation during this time period. Would you take us back to that time and describe the political and social climate after the Indian Removal Act and before the commencement of the removal?
Yes. Actually, I will start a little bit before then.
Okay.
Georgia, when they gave up their western lands that are now the states of Alabama and Mississippi, signed a compact with the U.S., and the U.S. agreed to eliminate all Indian title to lands within the state of Georgia. So the Georgians had been after this for many, many years. Mm-hmm. And immediately after Jackson was elected president in 1828, then they started enacting laws against the Cherokee Nation and the Cherokee people, including extending their jurisdiction over the lands in the Cherokee Nation. They also forbid the assembly of our tribal government. And because of this, we had to move our tribal council meetings out of our capital of Newashota. First in 1831, it was moved to Alabama, but that was not centrally enough located. So they moved it to Red Clay, Tennessee, where they held their councils until removal. So that was one of the major effects, was not allowing us to conduct our own government.
Absolutely.
And then also the law said that no Cherokee could testify in court. So this also opened it up to the Georgians being able to inflict whatever danger they needed on the Cherokees themselves to influence them to remove.
So many strikes against us, one after the other, continued.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Krystan, the controversial Treaty of New Echota, signed in December of 1835 and ratified in May of 1836, established the terms by which the Cherokee Nation would cede its territory in the Southeast and move to what was then known as Indian Territory, now the Cherokee Nation Reservation in present-day Northeast Oklahoma. Two groups dominated the political landscape surrounding that treaty. One was known as the Treaty Party, and the other was the Cherokee government, led by Chief John Ross. Can you tell us more about the politics and actions of both groups?
Yes. So initially, the Cherokees were united in their opposition to removal. But following the inaction on the part of the federal and state governments in the Wooster v. Georgia case, there was a group of Cherokees that more or less became disillusioned with this opposition to removal. And amongst themselves, they kind of concluded that the only option that was really left was to go ahead and negotiate a treaty to remove to the west with the United States. So that group, which was primarily led by a man by the name of Major Ridge, and then his son and nephew and several others, they kind of got together and they concluded amongst themselves that this was the only avenue forward. And so in 1835, there were two commissions that went to Washington to argue on behalf of the Cherokee Nation. There was Ross's committee, and then there was also the Treaty Party. And even though they were making arguments for different types of terms, nothing really came of that. So in December of 1835, the Treaty Commissioner asked the groups to convene at New Echota, Georgia. And Ross and his supporters, they did not attend the meeting. And so the only people who were there were the Treaty Party members, along with about maybe 200 people who supported removal. And so that was initially when the Treaty of New Echota was signed on December 29th of 1835, and then it was later ratified. But, You also had on the other side Principal Chief John Ross and his supporters, the government of the Cherokee Nation, a vast majority, an overwhelming majority of Cherokee people who all still remained staunchly opposed to removal. And those people actually got together and signed a document that protested removal. And it had thousands of signatures, asking the U.S. Senate to reject the treaty, because when it comes down to it, the treaty party really had no legal authority to sign a treaty on behalf of the government. But the U.S. welcomed this defection of this group because they were willing to negotiate on the level that they wanted to negotiate. Ultimately, the treaty was ratified by the Senate and signed into effect by President Andrew Jackson, but that was primarily the two groups that you had opposing each other.
That was a great summary. So speaking of that document, Jack, that she was just talking about, it has 13,000 Cherokee signatures on it that Chief Ross presented to Congress in 1836. And those signatures were from the people who opposed that unauthorized treaty. So what effect did it have on Congress?
Well, the petition initially, of the 13,000 signatures, was requested by Chief John Ross because he was in Washington whenever the treaty was signed. So he sent word back to Deputy Chief George Lowry asking him to create this petition of people opposed to it. And that was started on a snowy February day in 1836 at Red Clay. And then it was hand delivered by one of the Cherokees to John Ross in Washington, D.C. And he had tried to present it to the Senate, and he did present it at least to the Secretary of the Senate. It doesn't appear that it was ever really given to the Senate while they were in session. So it was not presented to the House, to the floor of the Senate.
So they kept it from seeing the light of day,
Yes.
essentially? I never knew that. Interesting.
Yes.
Krystan, I'd like to back up to 1832 and the Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia. The U.S. Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee Nation, recognizing it as a sovereign entity and not subject to the laws of the state of Georgia. What reasons did President Andrew Jackson have to disobey the Supreme Court's decision?
First, I think it's important to understand the context of that case, because there were actually two cases that were brought before the Supreme Court on behalf of the Cherokee Nation and Georgia's attempt to enforce its laws on people living within Cherokee Nation. So in the first case, which was Cherokee Nation v. Georgia in 1831, although the court did recognize Cherokee Nation sovereignty, they basically stated, and I'm definitely paraphrasing here, but they basically stated that the Cherokee Nation wasn't the right party to bring the suit. And so even in that case, which was a year earlier, the court was recognizing that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity. So when you flash forward a year later, you have Samuel Worcester and Eliza Butler, who are two missionaries who lived among the Cherokee, and they had been arrested, convicted, and sentenced because of a Georgia law that was forbidding them to live within Cherokee Nation. And so they brought the suit against the state of Georgia, claiming that these laws were unconstitutional because they wouldn't apply within Cherokee Nation's jurisdiction. Now, the court did, in fact, reaffirm that Cherokee Nation is a sovereign entity and the laws from the state of Georgia don't apply. However, Jackson did not enforce that ruling, and the state of Georgia essentially ignored that the ruling happened altogether. Now, most people think that Jackson's inaction was essentially because he did not want to act and enforce this ruling, but there was a technical legality to it as well. There had been a law passed that actually required for the president or the Supreme Court to step in and enforce the ruling. The state of Georgia had to submit in writing that they were not going to follow the ruling. And the state of Georgia, like I said, they essentially just ignored that this had even happened. And eventually, Samuel Worcester and Eliza Butler ended up petitioning the state. They ended up saying, okay, we're going to drop this case. we're not going to fight this anymore. And, you know, requesting a pardon from the governor of the state of Georgia so that way, you know, they could be released from prison. Because in the months following the Supreme Court's decision, they were still in prison. They had been sentenced to hard labor. And so essentially the state of Georgia's refusal to acknowledge the decision and Jackson's refusal to acknowledge or act on the decision really wore their resolve down. And that's when they decided to back off from their suit.
Very interesting. Learning a lot of new details today that I hadn't heard before. So, Jack, the Indian Removal Act was signed in 1830, and the forced removal of the Cherokee people from our homelands began in 1838. Can you tell us about how this impacted Cherokee daily life during these years?
Yes. I'd mentioned earlier that no Cherokee could testify in court. So this allowed any of the Georgians or white people who wanted to come in and steal livestock, money, or whatever from the Cherokees. The Cherokees could not testify against them in the court of law. So this had a major impact because the Cherokees in Georgia lost many of their possessions during this time. Also during this time, Georgia had a land lottery to give out all of the lands of the Cherokee people, which technically was not to take effect until after the removal, unless a Cherokee abandoned his property. But nevertheless, many of the white people came in and forced the Cherokees out. John Ross had a large plantation, and when he returned home from D.C., he found that his family had been dispossessed and forced out. And many of our Cherokee leaders were forced out of their homes that had the larger, nicer homes and moved into southern Tennessee, most of them in the vicinity of Red Clay. So this was a major impact on our Cherokee people and forced many of them to leave Georgia and move into Tennessee even before the roundup.
Just the thought of that moment when the settlers would come in and force you out of your property is just, it's hard to fathom what that must have been like, and knowing that could come. I mean, morale amongst Cherokee people had to be at an all-time low, and there's probably a lot of fear as well.
Yes, there was.
Okay. One last question for you both. What is one lesson that you would like for viewers to understand about removal, about the pre-removal time period? If there's one kind of nugget that you want them to remember, Jack?
I think that it's the Cherokee people, for the most part, as Krystan had said earlier, being unified against removal and determined not to remove in spite of the treaty that had been signed.
Yeah. Krystan?
I would say it's the Cherokee Nation's lasting legacy and impact on what we call federal Indian law today, because the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia case and the Wooster v. Georgia case together make up two of what's called the Marshall Trilogy, because they were all opinions that Chief Justice John Marshall issued. And the Marshall Trilogy really stands as the foundation of our federal Indian law today. And in both of those decisions, Cherokee Nation's status as a sovereign entity was affirmed and then reaffirmed again in the Wooster v. Georgia case. And that's a status that we maintain today. And I think that it's really the Cherokee Nation's lasting impact on the whole field of federal Indian law, because they did oppose removal, but not only did they oppose removal, they opposed it in the playing field of the federal government and brought suit in Supreme Court. And I think that just the lasting impact of that is what I would want people to take away.
That's really interesting. Okay, thank you both so much for being here. We are going to watch a couple of stories and come back, and we will ask you about the removal itself and the post-removal era. So stay tuned. We'll be back with them. In the meantime, Joseph Erb, a Cherokee Nation citizen and current faculty member at the University of Missouri, was instrumental in revitalizing the Remember the Removal Memorial Bike Ride. Inspired by his own experience in the Remember the Removal ride, he produced a Google map which can be found on the at-large website, cherokeesatlarge.org. This map connects significant locations along the trail with journal entries written at these locations. We spoke with Joseph and other riders during a past bike ride about the impact the Remember the Removal ride would have on them as Cherokees.
People don't realize to the degree of how brutal the Cherokee removal was. We didn't want to move to Oklahoma, but the brutality of it, the first 1,800 were forced from their homes onto boats, suffered great loss. It was the removal of our homeland away from everything we knew. Our stories are tied to it. So when these kids travel this whole distance and see all these major sites, they're changed. They bleed, they sweat, they cry. It's hard on them. And they do it as Cherokees. They do it together.
Getting prepared for this has been extremely fun. I've been waiting for months for this, and I'm ready now.
We found out, those of us that are on the ride, that we got accepted in January, and we really started training in early February. So, I mean, it's been a pretty long process ever since then. It's been bike training.
At the very beginning, training was difficult, but I just remembered my ancestors went through worse than I did.
In our send-off ceremony, I didn't really understand the spiritual, emotional, mental kind of toll that it takes on you.
Have a great trip. Love you too.
Oh, it was emotional, saying goodbye to my mom and my brother.
As we were leaving, I had to leave my nephew, and I did not want to. I was there the day he was born, and it was hard leaving him because I know I'm going to miss so much.
Okay,
Wave. I think it's weird because we've been training for so long, and the end is finally, the goal is finally in sight. It's been months. Yeah, it's gonna be fun.
The car ride was phenomenal with all the friends that I've made, and it was a great time.
The first thing we did was we drove from Tahlequah, Oklahoma, all the way out to Cherokee, North Carolina to meet up with the Eastern Band.
In 2011, the Eastern Band started sending riders with us, which I think is really important.
Arriving in North Carolina and meeting the Eastern Band and everything was amazing.
We get to learn a lot about each other, and become friends, a bond that we share for a lifetime with this experience.
We do have our differences, our cultural differences, but a lot of stuff still is the same.
It kind of shows that we are one people. We come in solidarity to honor this event that affected both of us. We get genealogists to actually go through their kids' past. Once they do our genealogy, we know where our families came. And they track it from removal time all the way back, sometimes to the 1700s.
Knowing about our ancestors, knowing about each other, where we each come from.
It's one thing to talk about who your relatives are, but it's another to see them.
Charles Hicks, he was a Principal Chief, so I'm a direct descendant of his brother, William.
Tristan Tremblay is actually my third cousin. Didn't know that.
Haley Cavanis, she's a direct descendant of Sequoia, which she didn't even know about.
That's what gets me through this ride now, is knowing I can do it for him. You're not doing this alone.
Details regarding the removal have been documented since before the first detachments departed our ancestral homelands. We have records that provide insight into the different detachments, including the routes they took, the number of Cherokee people in each detachment, and about the unimaginable suffering and loss they experienced. One detail that is often overlooked, though, happens in the weeks and months leading up to the first detachments leaving. The federal government began, as many people described it, herding Cherokee people and placing them in concentration-styled internment camps, beginning in 1838. Yet many detachments did not leave until the winter. Krystan, Jack, welcome back. I would like to start with you, Krystan, and playing off of what I just talked about, why did the federal government do this, and what do we know about that period of time in Cherokee history?
So with the signing of the Treaty of New Echota, there were actually certain conditions that were listed in the treaty, and one of them was a deadline for removal. So the treaty was signed by President Andrew Jackson on May 23rd, 1836. So the deadline for removal was 2 years from that date. In the spring of 1838, by that point, there was only a small number of Cherokees that had actually removed to the west. There were some, but by and large, a majority of the Cherokee Nation still remained in their homelands. So the federal government actually started making preparations for a military roundup. Thousands of state and federal troops ended up convening in the territory in May of 1838. And by May 26th of 1838, the military roundup began. And so within about a week, a majority of Cherokees had been herded essentially into these stockade camps where they would wait for removal. Now, there were some detachments that left in June of 1838 under military escort, and probably about 3,000, because it was about 1,000 apiece. But one of the detachments, they made the journey, I think it was in just over 2 weeks, and they had no deaths that occurred along the way. I believe that might have been the only detachment that had no deaths that occurred along the way. But the other two military-led detachments, there was immeasurable suffering. They had drought conditions that forced them to abandon their water routes. They had sickness that was running rampant in these, hot, humid summer months in the South. And so removal was essentially postponed until later in the fall. And that gave the Cherokee Nation time to negotiate their ability to oversee the remainder of the removal themselves. So going back to why the federal government would do this, they were enforcing the deadline that they had set for removal. And Cherokee people were forced to comply with that.
Okay. Jack, I want to ask you about the human impact, the emotional toll of those who were, quote, driven like cattle, as it was commonly referred to by Cherokees. Specifically, would you begin with what happened after the removal deadline of May 23rd, 1838?
Yes, immediately afterwards, as Krystan had noted, many of the soldiers were in the Cherokee Nation. General Winfield Scott had been sent a couple of years before to oversee as part of removal. And they first began the roundup in Georgia. And then within a week or so, they had rounded up everyone in Georgia and had moved them to Ross's Landing, which is present Chattanooga, Tennessee, in preparation for a water removal.
Mm-hmm.
So there were the three detachments that Krystan mentioned that left from there during June. And they were forced rather hurriedly, and families were separated often. So, and as she said, there was a large number of fatalities, particularly in one of the groups. There were 147 people died, and only 450 arrived out of that one detachment. So, because of the drought, they could no longer go by water. So the Cherokees asked that they be permitted to wait until the fall when the rain started. And so permission was granted. And during this time, John Ross, who had been in D.C. with a delegation trying to negotiate a new treaty, returned to the nation, and they petitioned General Scott to allow the Cherokees to be in charge of their own removal. And so this was also granted. So during that summer, they organized into the 12 detachments that left under the leadership of John Ross and the Cherokee Nation. And then the final 13th detachment went by water with John Ross with the people who were too sick to leave and go by land. So during that summer, there were many, many deaths because they were forced into these confined quarters. And so there's measles, dysentery, other diseases that spread rapidly and killed many of the people in the camps during that period. So, and some of the families, as I said earlier, had been separated. Fortunately, during this time, some of them were able to get back together whenever the Cherokees took over.
It's really unimaginable. It's hard to even fathom what they were going through and what life was like back then.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Okay, Krystan, can you tell us how important are Reverend Buttrick's journals to our understanding of that egregious period in our history?
His journals are immeasurably important to us. Reverend Buttrick actually arrived in Cherokee Nation in 1818 and spent the next 20 years living among the Cherokee. And even though a lot of the missionaries left in 1836, he and his wife stayed behind. And so they experienced removal in the same way that the Cherokees experienced removal. They asked to be allowed to accompany one of the detachments, one of the Ross detachments, during the removal. And so they traveled with the Cherokee. They lived through this experience with the Cherokee. And he kept the daily journal. And I would say it's one of the most comprehensive eyewitness accounts of what life was like immediately leading up to removal, during the actual journey, and following removal when they arrived in Indian Territory.
And that's something I know that a lot of Cherokees want to hear, those firsthand accounts, and there aren't very many of them out there. And so I know that his accounts are available for people to purchase. His journal, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, moving on to our next question. Jack, during this dark period, federal policies enforced the development of those concentration-style internment camps that we were just speaking of, where Cherokee people were forced to live awaiting their eventual removal, which I can't imagine. Are there records pertaining to oral histories passed down by families of survivors of those camps?
Interestingly enough, there are almost no oral histories of that time period. There was one of my ancestor that another branch of the family had, where she had given birth and was too weak to move and was told to immediately cross this stream, which she was not able to do, and the soldiers killed her at that point. And Buttrick lists an almost identical account, which I believe likely was her. So there are few isolated family stories, but very, very few.
So, Krystan, when the detachments arrived in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, what was happening between them and the old settlers? So what did they do for food and shelter? What was the environment like here?
So first, the old settler Cherokees had already established their government here in Indian Territory. In the early 1800s, pre-removal, large numbers of Cherokees had traveled west of their own volition and established first in Arkansas and then in what we now know as northeast Oklahoma. And so the old settler groups, they were here for over 20 years. They had their own government, their own constitution. They had established their ways of life. They had established their homesteads. And then you have this large influx of Cherokees arriving from the east. About 16,000 people were forcefully removed, and about 12,000 of them arrived in Indian Territory. And so you've got thousands upon thousands of people coming in, and they have their own government that's already established that they've been living under. So you essentially have these two groups that are fully functioning groups, fully governed bodies, and they're occupying the same territory. And so at first there was some strife as they were kind of trying to figure out, how are we going to maneuver this? How are we going to operate? Is it going to be under your system? Is it going to be under our system? And so eventually in the summer of 1839, there was an act of union that was brokered between the Eastern Cherokees and the Old Settler Cherokees that unified it into one Cherokee Nation. Now, as far as food and shelter goes, as part of one of the conditions of the Treaty of New Echota, the federal government had to provide a year's worth of subsistence rations to the Cherokee people following their resettlement in Indian Territory. And so there were several depots that were established primarily along what is now the Oklahoma and Arkansas border, here in what is now northeastern Oklahoma, and most of the detachments disbanded at or near one of those depots, because those depots that's where you would get your subsistence rations, throughout that following year.
It's always, as you can tell, I'm always trying to imagine what, put yourself in our ancestors' shoes and what it would have been like then. So coming up with the new constitution while you're trying to rebuild your home, it's just really quite remarkable. Jack, would you tell us a little about those early years when the Cherokee government began to rebuild and about the experiences that everyday Cherokee people might have had as they began to establish their communities in this new land?
Yes. As Krystan said, we had our Act of Union, which was signed in August of 1839. We had our new Constitution that was signed in September of 1839, and we commemorated each year with our Cherokee National Holiday. But the Cherokee people, as they arrived at the different detachments, it was interesting. The full-bloods seemed to generally stay in that same area. For instance, the detachments from North Carolina settled in Delaware County, and virtually all of the so-called full-bloods of the Delaware County area are from those North Carolina Cherokees. But yet the mixed bloods seem to move about to different places. And sometimes they would move 2, 3, 4 times before they actually found a place where they wanted to settle.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the problems they had was the government rations that Krystan alluded to or spoke about.
Mm-hmm.
Was those contracts were given to government contractors.
Mm-hmm.
And the food frequently or most of the time was not of the best quality. And many times it was actually spoiled.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a government inquiry over that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a big problem they had with the adequate food. But nevertheless, they were able to establish their homes. And I think it's interesting that we recovered so quickly.
Absolutely. And finally, wrapping this up, what do each of you hope viewers of today's program come away with? Krystan, we'll start with you.
I think that I would want people to come away with, while our people suffered, our legacy isn't one of suffering, it's one of resiliency. And in facing adversity time and time again, we've continually come out on the other side, and we've continually rebuilt, and we've continually rebuilt better than ever. And so I think it's just that I want people to know how resilient the Cherokee Nation is, how resilient the Cherokee people are, and how our legacy is one of resiliency and survival rather than suffering.
Great. Jack?
I agree with Krystan that resilience is probably the main thing we should take out of this, that we were able to rebuild so quickly and adapt to our new lands. For example, our Supreme Court building that was finished in 1844, the oldest government building in Oklahoma, was completed only 5 years after we arrived. And our male and female seminaries were begun in 10 years later in 1849 and opened in 1851. So we were able to form our new government and form our new institutions quickly.
Don't you all feel like that resiliency is in our DNA? I mean, look where we are today. I feel like it definitely
absolutely
translated. All right. President Baker, we could spend hours talking with you about this subject. We greatly appreciate your time and your knowledge and honorable service to the Cherokee people. And Krystan, your ongoing service at the Cherokee Nation has brought great discoveries and a new energy to our collections and exhibits in our museum. So Wado to both of you for sharing your insights into this dark, yet, as you say, resilient time in our history. Wado. Next, we hear from 2 elected leaders who represent 2/3 of our tribal citizens on the council. First, Julia Coates has strong ties with the at-large organizations, which many of you are members, and shares with us her thoughts on the Cherokee Removal. After, we will hear from Tribal Counselor Johnny Jack Kidwell as he shares his message about the importance of educating ourselves about our history and sharing it with those around us.
So, it's January of 2022, and I'm thinking about 183 years ago, in January of 1839, when the very first detachments from the Trail of Tears were beginning to arrive on the Indian Territory. Additionally, I'm also thinking about those who had not yet arrived. All throughout December, There were about 8 detachments that got stuck in southern Illinois and were being slammed by snowstorms and blizzards throughout all that month. The rates of death in the month of December and early January were tremendous in that part of the country. And so we can imagine those detachments as they were beginning to finally be able to cross the Mississippi River in January, in several weeks to get all of them across, and then to begin the journey again through the mountains of northern Missouri, or southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. This is a particularly deadly time in the Trail of Tears. We've heard so much about the thousands of deaths that occurred, but this month of December and into January is where so many of them happened. As the people continued to arrive in the months ahead, we can only imagine the kind of trauma that they were suffering, that they were experiencing, and how that manifested for them. We know this story as a tragedy, and it is a tragedy. But we also have to remember that much of the story had actually occurred before the Trail of Tears itself. What we also have to remember are the years, the more than a decade of resistance that the Cherokee Nation had offered to this suggestion that we should be removed from our ancestral homelands. It was a strategic, sophisticated a resistance that we put forth. We persisted for years and years. We suffered hardships in the homeland too, as we persisted in this way. We fought. We gave everything we had to retain our ancestral lands. But unfortunately, as we know, we were not ultimately successful in that. The time period after the arrival, beginning in January of 1839 through the month of April, we still had detachments continuing to come in. And then for the decade afterwards, we saw the trauma unfold in front of our eyes. We saw a birth rate that dropped dramatically as women took time to recover their health, as people were so traumatized that it was inconceivable to even bring forth a new generation. We just could not see what our future was for many, many years. We saw people self-medicating to extraordinary degrees. We know that rates of alcoholism, that violence broke out within our people for about the 10 years afterwards. And in my thought, it's very much as a response to the traumas and the horrors of losing our homelands and the deaths that had occurred on this dramatic removal, this ethnic cleansing. We saw political killings. We saw the deaths of extraordinary leadership on all sides that occurred in the years afterwards. We saw, however, what we have to remember are the people who stood for their beliefs, the people who sought the greater good out of the ultimate situation, and that ultimately we were able to resolve this internally amongst ourselves. And what we finally have to remember is that after that horrific decade in which Cherokees were killing other Cherokees, we emerged into what is known as the Golden Age, the 1840s, the 1850s, emerging into a time period that was like no other that we've known in terms of the great rebuilding, the great reestablishment of our nation. We have to remember that although this is a story of tragedy, ultimately it is a story of persistence and of triumph. And it is a story that gave us our identity for all time afterwards. We are living in our own moment of tragedy, but we are also persisting, and we have to believe that ultimately we will triumph. Get vaccinated, folks. Get boosted. Mask up, and we will triumph in our time as well. Thank you.
CO, I'm at-large Tribal Council member Johnny Jack Kidwell. The removal is an important time for all Cherokees to remember and take to heart. It's important to remember not just for its many tragedies, nor the cruel treatment of our people by the government soldiers, but to know Cherokees were a sophisticated and learned society prior to the Trail of Tears. I encourage you to keep learning history, both your own family and the tribes as a whole. Cherokee Nation and its history is the most documented and researched of any tribal nation in America. Its cases before the Supreme Court remain the foundation of Indian law to this day. Cherokee Nation, through the Cultural Tourism Department, has a vast array of ways to help you continue learning history that binds every single one of us, all 400,000 around the globe. As your tribal counselor, I support continued investments made to retool living museums and also enhance online efforts to Cherokee wherever we are, especially in light of reduced travel and gatherings of at-large communities due to COVID. One of our ancient values is that we all take responsibility for one another's well-being. That's what we had to do during the removal, or we would not be here today. Our ancestors had the grit and determination, not just to survive the removal, but to thrive afterwards. I know we will continue to thrive today. I appreciate your time. Wado.
Wado counselors. To wrap things up today, Kevin Stretch, Director of Community and Cultural Outreach and 2019 Mentor Writer on the Remember the Removal Memorial Bike Ride. Kevin, take it away.
Sionagad, Kalialega Jigadoha. As you have heard today, the events leading up to and including the removal were devastating to the Cherokee people. It tore our tribe apart from within and without. The decisions made at New Echota, for whatever reason, forever changed our tribe. These decisions would follow those signers to Indian Territory, and they would pay deeply with personal sacrifices. The trail was treacherous, and we lost a quarter of our people, our ancestors. Each Cherokee viewing today's program has a relative whose strength and resolve made it through the perilous journey. We are from the strongest, the survivor's blood. Though the removal has had lasting impact, we did not lose our culture, we did not lose our language, and we certainly did not lose our strong Cherokee values that we still practice every day. Survivors of the removal immediately began rebuilding our great nation, our communities, our villages, our governmental bodies, trades, educational system, our language, and rebuilt our ceremonial grounds so that we could reignite Sacred One fire. Our ancestors persevered when the federal government did not expect them to, did not want them to. Viewers, I ask that you take an active role in researching your history. Share it with your family and friends. Now today we have heard something rare, something truly special. Cherokee perspectives about the removal, about what our elders called Degeji Ilustana when we were driven like cattle. Even our Cherokee band cousins describe it as the time when everyone disappeared. Be proud and share the history of your ancestors. I challenge each of you to plan a trip, an extended trip to our ancestral homelands back east. On Cherokees at Large website, you'll find a link to an amazing Google map produced by Joseph Erb, which denotes not only the many routes and detachments, but known burial sites, concentration camps, and more, and includes Buttrick Journal pages on the locations where the events occurred. There is nothing more profoundly impactful as standing on the spot your ancestors once tread. We are currently faced with another extremely serious threat to our survival. COVID continues to take our elders and our first language speakers from us. We must all come together to protect each other. Cherokee Nation officials continue to agree, based on science and facts, that vaccinations, including boosters, masks, sanitization, and social distancing are still the most effective methods. So I strongly urge you to do your part. Be a role model in your family, in your community. I will continue to pray for our collective health and strength. Wado. Now, Cherokee National Tommy Wildcat will close our event. Tommy?